How many have been here before? Good to see you back. My name is Jeanette Windle. I write fiction and nonfiction and work in training Christian writers. And today we will be looking at one of my nonfiction titles and workshop. This is my 20th anniversary year for Lit World. My first role was 1998 in Hialeah, where I met. My first role was 1998 in Hialeah, where I met Daniela, who spoke this morning. Daniela, Kayla Ochoa, Ina Reyes, and others. And I just had to chuckle because this is my 9th Lit World, and Daniela has never been in charge, and nobody has ever started on time until this year. And so I was so impressed. He has us trained to be in our seats 5 minutes ahead. That says much in itself. So it is a wonderful privilege to be here with you, and you should each have on your seats a book, All Saints. If you picked up more than one copy, a book, All Saints. If you picked up more than one copy, please give up the other, because there are a few people that I know did not get one that came in. So if you do have an extra copy, just make it available. But I want to just give thanks to Baker Group. Baker Group was my publisher for this book. People keep asking me if my book became a movie. Actually, it's the other way around. Sony decided to make this powerful story of God's grace into a movie, which is hard enough in the second market. And the Baker Group was contracted to write the True Life book to go with the movie. And I was called to ask if I would write the book. So Baker graciously sent all these copies for free to Lit World. And so thank you for having me. Yay. So let's get started, okay? We will be talking about a story to tell, writing the compelling True Life title. The True Life title can be said is often the bread and butter of Christian publishing. Far more than niche books or fiction, telling a great, powerful story. I think of some of the books that have influence on me, even as a teenager. Brother Andrew's book, and I'm forgetting the title. Smuggler, The Cross and the Switchblade, the Nicky Cruz, Victor Torres stories. So many great stories out there, and every country has great stories to tell. So I hope by the end of this process, in 90 minutes, we cannot tell you everything there is to write about writing the perfect True Life title. The good news is there's email. So if I leave a question unanswered, please drop me a note or ask me after the class. What I would like to ask is if you have questions because something I'm currently saying is not clear, raise your hand and we'll ask a question. If you have a question about something else, trust that I may be talking about it in a little while, and wait till the end, because I'm hoping to get through the basic material so we have time for some questions at the end. So, the True Life title. It basically comes down to two types. The first one is biography. One of my favorite biographical true life stories that I had the opportunity to be part of the editing is Champion by David Waweru. David Waweru, of course, is a longtime friend at MAI. He was part of our host team in Kenya, the publisher of Word Alive. But Billy Graham, Dancing from Darkness, the incredible story of a World War II survivor. That's biography. The other main type of true life story is what we call life crisis. Something big happens, it hits the news, and suddenly they want to have a story about it. And some examples are, 90 Minutes in Heaven, the Don Piper, Assis Murphy story, In the Presence of My Enemies, the Gracia and Martin Burnham story when they were kidnapped by the ISIS affiliates in the Philippines, Prisoners of Hope, and then of course just 3 of my own titles, All Saints, the book you have in your hand, Forgiven. It was my first Baker Group title, and was the reason I got the call for All Saints, was I was asked to write the book about the Amish school shooting and A Mother's Love and Story of Remarkable Grace. And in that particular case, they assumed it would be a book for the Christian market, and it was stunning when it ended up on the cover of Guardian magazine and Newsweek and Times magazine, BBC, CNN, because that message of forgiveness resonated. I love what our keynote speaker, talked about yesterday, of writing locally and with a global impact. And who would have thought that a story of a horrific event in Amish country and the story of the mother of the shooter could ever become a global story to the secular world, that forgiveness really is an option. So, and then Hope Underground, the first book of this sort that I was contracted to write, partly because I am bilingual, I grew up in Latin America, and that was the story of the Chilean mine rescue. Those of you who may remember in 2010, just a personal note on that. They wanted the book. I was contacted to do the book. They wanted it in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, for the anniversary of the Chilean mine rescue. I have never written, I wrote 2 of the languages, and our turnaround was just over 2 months. I thought I was going to die. So I am going to give you some good principles today that I'm hoping you will never have to take a book like that. And I was doing the interviews, with people in Chile. It was the story of the pastor of Camp Esperanza, as they said, the Christian pastor, who, if you remember the news stories, 1 billion people watched the rescue. And the pastor who sent those miniature Bibles down the pipe 2 miles down, that was the person whose story I got to write. So I'm doing interviews by Skype with Chile. The publisher was in South Africa. The process, I'm going to be using as examples several of my own titles, not because they are the best titles out there, but because I know them well and the process by which I wrote them, so I can share examples through them. So I just want to ask a quick question while I'm here. This is the nonfiction track, so I'm assuming you're not all necessarily here with the idea in mind, to write a true life story, but how many people here? Okay, hopefully by the end of this session, you might be able to walk away and say, I will do both. Or when the door opens and a story, like I said with Baker Group, they just called and said, we have this story, Sony's turning into a movie. Well, you write the book. It helps to have those skills under the belt. So if the right opportunity and story comes along, you can say, I can competently write that story. So that is what we will be covering today, and we're going to be just going through. Does everybody have handouts? Okay, and you won't need to look at the handouts much. I gave you handouts with a fairly lengthy appendix because I wanted you to have all of the little examples that I'm going to use you throughout. So when you get home at leisure and recovered from the overload, you can go back and say, okay, what was the point that was made, what was the examples you used, and just look through your notes. But you probably don't need to worry about the handouts now except to take notes, because we'll be covering it here. So the first step in writing a book, a true life story, is gathering the material. Again, 2 basic types. First, who is your source? If you're writing your own story, obviously the material is going to be your personal experience. A good example of that was David Waweru's Champion, which was his autobiography, and excitingly, how many of you here know David Waweru? Well, if you don't, he has been part of the MAI network for many, many years, and not very long ago, he posted on Facebook, his book became required reading for all high schoolers in the country of Kenya. His Christian biography. So personal experience. However, again, the bread and butter of writing this type of book, and in the future, especially if you're working with a publishing house, editorial house, this may be what comes to you is a story comes along, or a great patriarch of the faith of your country, and you're asked to say, can we write a book about this person? So that comes to interview. If you're writing somebody else's life story, you're going to have to use interviews. And there's basically 2 types of interviews that you're going to have to do if you are interviewing. And the first is your primary subject. If you pick up the book that I just gave you, you will notice that the co-author, who of course did not write a single paper or word except the foreword, the co-author, it says, Reverend Michael Spurlock. Terry Roberts, the mother of the school shooter, was the co-author listed for Forgiven. And those would be what we would consider the primary subjects of the book. So typically you will have to sit down and do interviews for the primary subject of the book. But in most books, depending on what you're going to write, you may also end up with secondary sources. In All Saints, I had the privilege, Baker Group flew me down to Tennessee where the church is, that you see on the book, while they were filming the movie. I actually spent my time there. If you have seen the cover, that's John Corbett, a very well-known actor. The real Reverend Spurlock looks nothing like that. And I spent my time doing the interviews down there and dodging the cameras because they kept saying, well, don't you want to be an extra in this scene? It's like, no, I can comb my hair today. The movie finished, the movie came out and I got an email from somebody from All Saints. They said, did you know you're in the movie? I said, no, I tried very hard not to be. Well, I guess when in the credits, the cameras were going around. In the credits, they put pictures of the real people, so you could see like the real people. It's, wow, they look nothing like the movie stars. And in the very last credit, there's a scene of me in the church shaking the pastor's hand. I was so thankful it was Sunday morning and I had dressed up. But during the time I was there, I probably interviewed more than a dozen subjects that were either the Korean War refugees who were part of the story, the people in this church who were part of the story, and all of that information was added on to my principal interviews where I went to New York City and spent 3 days interviewing Reverend Michael Spurlock and his wife. So when you're gathering material, if it's your personal experience, simple. All you have to do is think, what are my experiences I want to write about? If you're writing somebody else's story, it's going to be interviews and it's going to be research. And we're going to be talking specifically about some practicalities of how do I capture the material. And actually, 2 options. I'm going to actually tell you this. Number 1, writing. Do not worry about excellence. And I'm going to show you some examples of my interviews. When I am doing another person's story, I'm a very fast typer. Years ago, I used the little recorders, and then I discovered you have to go home and type it up. Now, because I can type as fast as people talk, I do my interviews, I take my laptop, they're talking to me, I'm talking, listening, and I estimate 20 to 30 hours interviews is what I have learned after 5 books it's going to take for a 50,000 word book. And so that in itself is a major investment of time. If it is your autobiography, there are people who are natural speakers and can tell their stories recording or dragging. But I want to pass on one tip because so many here raised their hands saying, I'm interested in writing my own story. You may all be great writers, but it can be very, very frustrating, and I have worked with many writers writing this type of book who they knew they had these powerful stories. They tell them over again, they speak, but when they try to sit down to write, it escapes. But the reason is because they're storytellers. And so the easiest way, if you find yourself wanting to write your book and you are bogged down, find somebody who's willing to be your audience. The same process that I am sitting here listening to someone's story and typing it down, because when you tell your story, that's when the little precious bits and memories and emotions come out. And the other person could say, now wait a minute, you forgot to tell me about this, and interrupt, and I have discovered that if you're writing an autobiography, the easiest way to do it is to find somebody, if they commit to say, okay, we're going to do 3 hours in an evening, over a period of 2 months, maybe once or twice a week, you've got your 20 or 30 hours of interview. And just let them record your story then you either transcribe it yourself or you pay a reasonable fee to some really smart teenager who's good in language at school to type it up for you, and you will discover I've got at least 40,000 words here. Now all I have to do is what I'm going to teach you to do next, and that's taking the raw interview and turning it into a powerful book. So, how to capture material. Either through interviews, but if you're telling your own story, consider doing it also through interview. Just let somebody else do your interview. So interviews, and again, I mentioned that when I do interviews, I have come to the place where I just type. I tried the whole dragon thing, but it has to, you know what dragon is?
No.
The program. It's a program that you can speak and it transcribes your voice. And what I discovered is they sell those, like, what's the person on cell phone? Siri. But they get to understand your voice, and so, you know, I thought, well, this is great, I'll never have to transcribe again, I'll just interview people. No, the thing only learns your voice, and so when you try to interview somebody else, it's just, so I personally, because I am a new typer, have just learned, I sit there with my fingers and I let them pour their hearts out to me and put it on paper. But again, for yourself, time frame.
And do you tend to record as well as type in case you miss anything or not?
I don't. I did at one point, and I will say, I don't think it's so much arrogance as just many, many years experience. And the fact that when I do this type of book, nothing ever goes to print without going back by the subject and letting them approve. So you are probably right, and if I were a journalist interviewing politicians, I would probably make sure I had my backup recording to prove what I wrote into my notes. But yes, it's your personal choice. You will decide whether it's you or somebody else what is the easiest way to do interviews. That said, again, I plan to expect 20 to 30 hours interviews for a 50,000 word book. Now here's the good news. You know, people say, well, how can I get enough material to fill a whole book? Depending on what language you speak. If you are from Chile, you will cover twice as many words per minute as if you are from Texas. And of course, you know, but the average person speaks 150 to 180 words a minute. If I switch into Spanish, I have learned over the years, the last 10 years of speaking presentations in English, and if I'm going too fast, let me know. Because when I learned to speak and teach in Spanish, and I'm used to going twice as fast. But I've learned to count. But either way, the average person speaks 150 to 180 words a minute. So what is the math there? You take somebody for 10 minutes, how many words do you have? That's a minimum already of 1,500 words. And so when people say, well, how am I going to get information? Believe me, by the time you've done 20 hours of interviews, you will have at least 40,000 words of raw material. Yes, some will need trim, but other will need in. But you will basically have the basis for your book right there. And so here's two examples that I want to give here, just as instructions. Because I do this a lot, and most of my clients, all saints with a very happy story. Forgiven, the honorable training. I just finished a book. The author is in Australia, and her daughter was killed in one of the most high-profile murders in Australia, and it's become a big news because it's the 10th anniversary, and so I'm helping her write a book. And I'm often dealing with subjects who are deeply, deeply traumatized, and you are having to get a story out of them. If you're telling your own story, you may also be telling material that's deeply, deeply traumatized. So I have learned a few practicalities in doing interviews, and again, if you're doing this yourself with a partner, they apply just as well. And the first one is to block out plenty of time. You just cannot rush pouring your heart or somebody else's heart down on text. You know, 3-4 hours, you'll probably have 1 or 2 solid hours of great material. But block out plenty of time, and again, I will do it when I am doing it for a publishing house and they're paying like travel expenses. We've usually arranged ahead of time that, like with Reverend Michael Spurlock, we had 3 full days for him and his wife. And so we would do blocks where he would be talking for 3 hours and just be totally emotionally spent. I was exhausted because then he would go and be able to recover and stuff, and I would go through the next 3 hours with his wife doing the same emotionally spent. But blocking out plenty of time, and the next thing, it's very, very practical. Get comfortable. I have often done these type of interviews either in my home, somebody else's home, and I will just say, okay, find a chair, make yourself comfortable, get the stool, put your feet up, be completely relaxed. I'm over here. We are now 2 friends chatting, and we can be comfortable. And so here are, I'm going to actually give you a list of 6 questions that I actually, or a list of 6 pointers I literally tell my clients. Block out plenty of time, get comfortable, you and the subject, and then plan for interruptions. When people tell stories, and this is why it's often hard to write your own memoir, and it can be easier to tell your memoir, is when people tell stories, they don't tell everything. You know, they leave out important, because in their mind, they have all this back information. And so, when you are doing interviews or when you are writing your own, you need to plan for interruptions, clarifications, and follow-up questions that arise. And here are just 6 points that I actually start out before we're interviewing, which will probably be a good part of the next week together, or maybe extended over several weeks of interviews. And I tell them this. Number 1, I think you have that there. Okay? Number 1. Just tell your story in as much detail as possible. Just tell your story in as much detail as possible. Don't try to make it sound good, polish it, or be for the platform. Just tell every detail you can think of. So that's number 1. Number 2, include your emotions, reactions, spiritual applications, and takeaway for the reader. Let me repeat that. Include your emotions, reactions, spiritual applications, and takeaway for the reader. And what I mean by that, I had one client, the World War II book. She was dumped. She was born in America, German parentage, and she was literally given away by her mother and dumped in the middle of Eastern Germany at the outset of World War II and left there. And how God met her, this little lost girl stuck in this place, is epic enough for a movie. But she had spoken her story for over 40 years. She'd been trying to write her book. She finally contacted me. God had brought her to the place where she was wealthy enough that she was donating Bible college dorms, and so she finally decided, okay, you need to write my book. I'm not going to keep trying. I'm now over 80 years old. She had told her story for so many years that she would sit, and you'll see a few examples, and tell these incredibly impelling stories, and then immediately break off and say, and here's what God showed me. And I thought, you are the perfect client, because most people, when you're trying to get their story, you are pulling teeth to get spiritual application. You could tell she had been telling these stories and giving grace to God for 40 years, because when she sat down to tell them to me, it's like, so, but I will just tell the client or the interview subject, include your emotions, your reactions, spiritual applications, takeaway for the reader. Don't wait till the end. If this is happening to you, how did you feel about it? What did God say to you in the middle of it? What do you wish that people would know into it? And again, the number 3, don't worry about being organized. Don't worry about being organized, having perfect wording, or even being chronological. That's the advantage of the interview process, because we can always jump back. And so it's like, I will say, just tell the story, get in, and in my mind, I'm thinking, hey, you just jumped 2 years, and there's something really interesting back here. But I know in my mind, as soon as that she or he has done that little section, then I'll say, but what happened back here? And that's number 4. And I tell the author, the client in advance, the subject, Partly because I do work with many, many different cultures. And in some cultures, it's much ruder to interrupt. I do a lot of journalism in India and Sri Lanka and different places. And I'm a woman. So, you know, I'm interviewing these august, great pioneers of the faith in Orissa, India, or some of these places. And it's enough that I'm the journalist as a woman talking to them for me to interrupt. So I actually will tell them all when I start. I will routinely be interrupting you to ask for additional details, chronology, clarifications. This is not to be rude, it's part of the interview process, so I don't miss any part of your wonderful story. And so that way, when they know in advance, because believe me, I do. And I will constantly be jumping in because they're kind of skipping over important parts of emotions, etc. So I will routinely be interrupting you. Expect it, I'm not trying to be rude. And then number 5, this will, go ahead. Yes. I will routinely be interrupting you to ask for additional details, chronology, clarifications. This isn't to be rude, but it's part of the process, so I'm warning you in advance, okay? And then number 5, and surprisingly, this has applied in my experience at this point to both genders. This will be an emotional and even cathartic experience. So at any point, feel free to cry, to take a break to regather your emotions, or even to say, I can't go any further today. And I can tell you, depending on how traumatic the story I'm telling, this has many times happened. And sometimes they'll say, oh, no, I want to keep going, just give me 5 minutes. And so I let them cry, spend 5 minutes. But I always let them kind of handle, if it's too much for you, just tell me and we can take a break. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering whether, do you ever email your questions ahead of time to your subject? Sorry.
Actually, that's a great question, and it does apply here, so I will answer. It depends on the project and the extent, because I do far more just plain journalism than full books. And and that's a whole different workshop that I teach. I do journalism around the planet because I'm the editor of a global mission magazine. And I have discovered it's far easier to do print interviews. So when it's like articles and events, I will often send the questions in advance, and they will send me back 20, 30 pages of answers, and we don't even have to do a Skype interview. When it comes to the book, and it's almost impossible because you don't know what to ask in advance. You know, it's like with All Saints or Forgiven or Hope Underground, the Chilean Miner. You first have to sit down and let them tell your story, and then you know, it's hard to know in advance what to ask. So, and then number 6, the last one, and I always make sure I tell my client this. What you share follows under client confidentiality. Be assured that nothing will end up in print without your approval, so you can feel free to share openly and vulnerably. It's the opposite of your gotcha, as they say in English journalism, where you're trying to catch a politician or someone and write something to hurt them. We're writing books to share God's grace, so we have no interest in. And so I just finished a book. It will be coming out in the spring. It's called Najiba, A Love Story from Afghanistan. And it's actually the sequel to a book published by Thomas Nelson, the John Weaver story. He was the only Christian expatriate aid worker working in the war zones in November of 2001, when the Allied forces and every journalist on the planet rolled into Afghanistan. And because, of course, his name ended up, he was the only one who spoke English, so he ended up all over the CNNs, BBC, NBC, etc. And so Thomas Nelson brought out his story inside Afghanistan. Well, I've had the wonderful privilege. I met him when I was in Afghanistan, and his wife, and it was this incredible story in itself. You'll just have to watch for the book, Najiba, Love Story from Afghanistan. So I got the call to write a book. You know, I've been in Afghanistan. I've written 2 books set in Afghanistan. So I spent a week with them documenting their story. And I wrote a book, and they were working in Afghanistan, and they were very, very open and very, very vulnerable and told beautiful stories. And when the manuscript got written and they read it, it was like, oh, we should never have said that. That will get us in so much trouble. But that was the whole point. And I said it before, and I told them after. I said, don't worry, because this is the draft. You go through there. If there's anything too sensitive that will cause trouble for your future ministry in Afghanistan, we simply take it out. And so that is the point that I always make sure to let them know is you can speak to me as openly and freely and emotionally as you want, because nothing will ever hit print that isn't in the end approved by you. So is that fairly clear? And I hope you can see that if you have a partner, you can kind of, and you're telling your story, basically have this same process. So interviews. Now, yeah. Once you have interviews are very raw. To write a good book of this sort, you have to take interviews and then you have to go back and research. And this is basically the task of a journalist. News reports, you know, online resources, Google Maps, etc. When I wrote Forgiven, for example, I have the mother's story. I have to go back and read and research all of the news events that happened at the time. I actually, because I was living in the area, which is why they had asked me to write a book, I went and drove down and I saw all the places where the events happened, so that as I'm writing her story, I can picture it in my mind. When I was writing All Saints, which of course the story takes place, the one that you have in your hand, it takes place between the refugee camps and the Civil War, the Korean Christian National People Group in the Civil War in Myanmar, formerly Burma, and this dying Tennessee church in rural Smyrna. And so I had to go all the way back and do my research, and I found a fascinating story, which when you read the book, you will see I had grown up in mission, so I knew the story of Adoniram Judson. I knew the basic story of the Korean and how they had come to Christ and under the Burmese persecution and 500,000 in the camps in Thailand and all the rest. But, you know, I didn't know. So I went back and I thoroughly researched, and I found a very interesting detail. You'll have to read the book. But one of the things I had not realized with this people group coming back to this dying Tennessee church and walking in and in the climate of the lack of friendliness to immigrants and everything that was happening in America, it became such a powerful story. Adoniram Judson was the very first missionary ever sent from North America to the mission field. The first person he ever led to the Lord was the first Korean convert. And all these years later, now seeing this people group bringing their faith back to a dying American church became just such a powerful story. Well, part of the book, the main character, and if you watch the movie, he's played by a South Korean very famous actor. But, you know, Ye Win, son, grandson, and great-grandson of church-planting Baptist missionaries in the hills of Myanmar. And at age 13, he runs away to join the other family business, as he put it, which was the generals and heads of the Korean Resistance Army, 13 years old. And so here I am interviewing him. And, you know, I'm a journalist as well as a writer. This is a book for Baker Group. This is going to be a movie. You can't just accept that every detail is true and not check your sources, or you can get in trouble. So Ye Win is telling me the stories about when he was a boy soldier, the things that happened. Being in 1988 and part of the riots of when the great peace activists of Myanmar came back and was put under house arrest. And then telling the stories about how he ended up on the Black Watch list to not be able to immigrate to Australia or America because he was heading up the student protest marches in front of the Burmese embassy in Thailand. So I'm thinking, okay, I can just accept his word, and I do. But I also need to document and check. And I went back and did what I do well, which is research. And I was able to track down, I found YouTube videos from CNN coverage of the student marches in front of, and I have the link, if anybody ever says, I'd like to see that, I have the link. Marching in front of with this big flag and anger, and there on the front with the flag is Yay Women. I thought, see, there I've just confirmed through research that the story I'm interviewing is not only true, but now I also am researching all of the background material to write it effectively beyond the interview. So you start out with interviews, but then you have to do that secondary research to do this effectively. So, yeah. What information to include? It's easy when you write a book, whether it's your own autobiography or you're writing a true life story of someone else. It's like, where do I stop gathering material and where do I start writing the book? And when I start writing the book, what do I include? And just a few points here of what information to include. And this, you talked about asking questions in advance by email. I don't send email questions in advance for a full book here, but I am thinking of what to include and what to tell. And the very first thing is, first, collect your interview first. Because until you know the stories, you don't really know what research and other materials going through it. But how do you know what stories to tell? And it's very simple, and this is what makes an autobiography powerful. If you're looking at writing your own book, David Wawaria's Champion, is you have to think, what are the significant stories? What are the scenes of your life if you're writing your story? What are the scenes of the story being told if you're telling someone else's story? In other words, what are the stories that when you tell your story to other people, when people tell the story of events that are told over and over and over to their friends, to their family, to their grandkids, to their churches. And I absolutely love, this is just, granted, this clip went through my editorial polish as opposed to raw interview. But Carlos Prada, the pastor of Camp Esperanza, as they called it, the big camp that kind of grew up around the Chilean miners, all these families were waiting for their loved ones to be rescued. And there were literally almost 1,000 journalists from all over the world on the ground there. And Camp Esperanza, and this is what he said in the interview that I did with him, that just to me encapsulates how we need to think of what we're going to put in a book like this, whether it's our autobiography or another. All of us who played a role, however small, in this incredible human drama, not just the miners and their families, but rescue crews, mining personnel, political figures, media, countless volunteers would later testify how this experience so deeply impacted our lives that we simply cannot stop talking about it. We tell the same stories again and again, stories of terrible hardship and great courage underground, of stunning engineering achievements and scientific ingenuity on the surface, family dramas, both distressing and heartwarming, moments of new despair and ultimate triumph. But there is another side to this story that needs to be told, a spiritual side. No account of the greatest mine rescue of all time would be complete without telling the stories of faith discovered and hope shared, unexpected miracles, differences laid aside, etc. And you will discover, again, whether it's your story or someone else's, what becomes that core of the story are the stories that you tell over and over, because they are the reasons you want to write this book, or somebody else does in the first place. So think scenes. What are the scenes? What are the stories? And then once you have those, and if you're writing your own book, think, okay, I'm going to make a list of those big stories of my life that I've always wanted to tell in my book. Those are the scenes of your book. Or if you're doing a book like this. Yeah, here, this was another one. I will just pass you here. We have some of these all here. But think scenes. Then, on top of the scenes, you need the biographical and historical details that are connecting the scenes. It isn't enough to tell a bunch of scenes. That's Grandpa at the Christmas dinner table. If you remember, did I ever tell you the story about? Those are to tell, but to turn it into a great book, you then have to have those biographical details, research, and connecting material to then connect all the stories together. So biographical details and events connecting significant scenes. And here's one of the points I just want to bring out, is create a thorough timeline. Whether you're writing your story or somebody else's, just sit down and actually make a timeline, significant names, events, dates. If you can't remember a specific day, at least the general year. It doesn't have to be organized, write it down. But I had the experience when I was just doing the book that I just finished of the mother whose daughter was murdered in Australia. And it was a great, like all stories that I am privileged to tell, the only reason to tell it is because in the end there's a great story of God's redemptive work. But it's not a happy story. And so, I'm dealing with her in Australia, and I would be writing back, and we're doing a lot of it by written communication versus oral. And I'd write little comments through her answers, and I'd say, but what about this answer, I need to know. I can't see it in my mind, which means the reader can. And she kept emailing back, and I could tell she was very, very traumatized because she's having to relive it all. And she said, I don't see why you need to know those things. So I very patiently, and that's part of the process as well, is understanding don't ever react harshly, because if they're reacting this way, it's because they're reliving trauma and pain. And so I just sent back, and she had read Forgiven and was very impressed with that process. I says, I'm not asking you to make you relive or to, it's just that the reader can't follow the story if they don't have the connecting chronology. And so that's what I said. I says, don't stress yourself about it, don't anything. Even if you have to get your husband, because he was not the father of the daughter and was the rock and all of this. I says, even if he helps you, just write down a timeline for me. You were born here, your siblings that you can't mention were born here, you moved from Portugal to France here, you moved from France to Australia here, your daughter was, all I needed was that chronology. 3 or 4 days later, she sends me this long list of dates. And it was all I needed to go back to her raw material and make it make sense. So you create that thorough timeline, including names, events, dates, years. And as you are doing this, and I'm going to add this if you are writing your own story. 3 things to consider as you're collecting your raw material. And again, I want to urge, don't try to write well. Don't try to have beautiful prose. All you're doing now is gathering your story, whether it's yours or someone else. But as you are pouring your stories down on, as you are getting the extra little details that are needed to make sense, as you're creating that timeline, think of 3 things. And again, write them down as unorganized, as poorly, as unchronologically as comes to your mind, but get them down on paper. And it's 3 main points. The first is, what are the emotional and spiritual high and low points of your stories or crisis that you're writing about? The emotional and spiritual high and low points. Because too often, when people write this type of story, they just tell the story. It's like this happened and this happened and this happened. And the reader says, oh, that's terrible. But what the reader needs, especially if you're given a story, is, okay, this happened. You were dropped into a war zone at 2 by a mother who abandoned you. And you spent the next 10 years under Hitler running from bombs. That's a fact. Now, what did you feel about it? What was the emotions? Because those emotions were what led to suddenly, as this bomb falls at 8 years old and a miracle happens, realizing there's somebody out there who cared enough about me to let me live to tonight. And so as you're writing, however messy and mixed up, get down on paper or in text, and again, tell somebody else the story if necessary. But the emotional and spiritual, both high and low points of all the stories you're telling. And then the second is, again, number 1, emotional, spiritual, high and low points. Number 2, what God has taught you through the events of life in crisis. Because it's not even enough to just tell the emotions. The reason you're writing this book is because you want the reader to be led down the same path to redemption and hope that either you experienced or your client that you're writing about has experienced. So what did God teach through all of these things? Just get it all down on paper or in text. And then the third is, what do you want the reader or posterity in general to take away from the events and life story you're telling them? And a really good example that did this well is, again, David Welbeer, the MAI leader in Kenya's champion. What do you want your reader to take away from this? We all have stories. So why should a reader read my story or this other story? There has to be a reason that they're going to take away something that will make a difference and impact on their lives. So get those things down. That's all of the material you have together. And again, the research, whether it's your personal memoir or contracted story, you have to have that research background. When I was writing Hope Underground, again, I had to go back and not just research all the events, and this was like for the anniversary of the event. So this is a year later is when the book came out. But not only all of the events and the news coverage and everything and what happened, but the Atacama Desert, the hottest, driest place on the planet where there has never in human history been recorded rain. I had to bring that place alive, and so I had to go back and research, etc. See that there? Yeah, I wanted to just give it a little bit of an example, talking about the raw material. This is a bit of my raw interview with Yewen. As you can see, not after 3 days fighting, daytime Burmese soldiers digging in, then in night coming, big guns shooting, I am in foxhole, sand keeps filling hole, etc. And of course, he is speaking with a somewhat broken, English is his fourth language, and he learned it coming to America. I am writing as fast, and as you can see, this is not very polished prose. And here is the actual finished scene of that exact event. And I'll just let you read there, and you just see what a difference it is. It's the exact material he gave me, but now written as a journalist in a form that you can put in a book. So yeah, your raw interviews, whether it's yours or someone else, don't worry about the sound, because all you want to do is get the material down, then you can go back and make it sound good. And this is actually another example from the Dancing from Darkness. When the first bomb fell, etc. Almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At that moment, I aged about 50 years. We're playing. This is all. I'm literally typing this, and she's got a very strong German accent with English. I'm typing it away. And if you come to, September 8, 1944 was the day of war in Plowing. And many of the details here it was all from her and things even that she threw in later. But with the background of having gone back and researched the bombing of Plowing, which is one of the most devastating bombings of World War II in Eastern Germany. Yeah, raw material. Okay, make sure I have this.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
About first person versus third person?
Yeah, we're going to get to there.
Okay.
Okay, good. Yeah, okay. Okay, so now, you've got your raw material. Can you kind of think in your mind, maybe with your own story that you're thinking of writing, that maybe some of the scenes and the events, etc. So you have your raw material. Now we have to organize our material. And I want to just cover a few basic points with some examples. And again, I have all the little clips in your appendix, so you can go back and look at them more leisurely. But the first is, of course, why am I not seeing it? This was just an example of Hope Underground having to write the events. Okay, well, I am feeling like our speaker this morning. I too was not forwarding slides. So, but yeah, reading research into the story, and maybe just point out this one here. when I was doing the Dancing from Darkness book, and of course I'm hearing these stories of a person who spent this awful childhood as an actual American citizen in the war zones. She knew nothing but her memories. And when I went back and researched, and the miracle that God allowed her to cross the border through what would, 2 weeks later, the Berlin Wall went up. And she crossed in. She had to cross over before her 13th birthday, or she would have been locked into the Russian zone and never be able to leave again as a born American citizen. And so, you know, when I did the research, I discovered, and I found the day she crossed over. It was literally 2 weeks before the Berlin Wall went off. And if she had crossed over 2 weeks later, she would have never ever until 1989 been able to, you know. And so this is just an example of where you take that raw story and you do research and you effectively add in the background material and begin. So, organizing the material. How do you now take this huge, messy, unwieldy amount of material and turn it into a compelling title, whether your own or somebody else's story for other people to read? And the first thing I like to say is to think hook. When you write news articles or even fiction, they say, well, what's your hook? What's going to draw the reader? Think hook. Number one, you know, what newsworthy significance does this person's story or your own have that's worth reading? Why did books like Prisoner of Hope, In the Presence of My Enemies, get published? Because they were taken captive by Islamic terrorists. Why did Hope Underground get written? Because 1 billion people watched the Chilean mine rescue. So what is the newsworthy significance? Unless it's just for family, there has to be a reason for somebody to read your book. And typically it's either it's a newsworthy significance or it's a very famous person. Or, if not, you need to have a hook. David Wawera would be the first to say that he's not a famous person. We think he is here at MAI. We love him. He's been a great leader in MAI Africa. And he's the publisher of the largest Christian publishing house in Kenya. But why did his book end up required reading for every teenager in Kenya? Because of the hook. The champion was the topic. He gave a compelling subject, which is you can all be champions, and here's how. So think hook. Is there a newsworthy significance of the story? Is there a life crisis that precipitated, like the Amish school shooting, or the Chilean mine collapse, or with All Saints? The reason it resonated is because when Sony finally decided to make the movie and then contract the book, it was at the height of its turning against caring about immigrants in the country into which these immigrants had arrived. And all of a sudden, this was something that's like the church needs this story, and it was told. So what newsworthy significance, what life experience? And then the last one is what images or themes are associated with the story in the public's mind. It's interesting, when I wrote Hope Underground, there was a story that went around the world. Ironically, it wasn't true. It was the story of these 34 miners that had been caught underground. And so they planted on this big knoll in the Atacama Desert 34 flags, one for each miner. And the people down there, when they finally established communication, is like, no, there's only 33 miners. And he says, no, we counted, there's 30 miners. And which became part of the theme of the book. To this day, they'll say the 34th miner was God. There were 34 down there. 34th was God. And so because that image had gone through the news, there's an image that's attached to this story in the public mind. That's part of how you can bring it into the story. So think hook. What is the hook? And then the Amish, forgiven. The image that went around the world were these Amish in their black clothes, this big crowd coming up over the hill as the family is burying their son with not one other person there because he didn't deserve to be honored. And here come the Amish up over the hill to show their support and forgiveness for the family. And so that image became the theme of the book, which was forgiven. So think what images, what events are associated with the story. And then, so think hook, and second, think, my jet lag is starting to come a little. Here's a really good example, imagery. As I interviewed, whether it's your own story, David Ware wrote his own, it was The Champion, or you're writing someone else, I listen. You know, I'm listening to people tell their stories, but I'm also listening to the images and the themes that are flowing through as they tell their story. When I was interviewing for Forgiven, over and over again, she would bring up these images as she's telling the story of that. It was like a storm, that she'd lived this life where there were soft rains and there were some hard storms with the death of a child and different things. And then when this happened, it's like this person who loved God, who literally stepped off the plane from a 2-week missions trip to help build a ministry compound the day before this happened, she's hit by a tsunami. And it's like God sent the tsunami and I was lost. And so as she talked, I'm listening to that, and you will see again, you know, I'm taking that imagery and turning it into the theme, the introduction of the book. Hope Underground, and I'm not, you have these in your appendix, I won't go through them, but the other story that they kept talking about was this white butterfly that was seen 2 miles underground where there are no butterflies, and the miners slammed on the brakes because of this white butterfly floating by, and the entire mine fell in front of them. And so that's another of the stories that was told over and over and over. And so that image became part of it. And this one was puzzle pieces, and you can read it there.